For the final lesson in the JavaScript side of things, we will learn how to write unit tests. We will focus on writing unit tests for MobX, because that's where most of our application logic will live, but also because MobX has some pitfalls that we need to work around. So in order to write our unit tests, we're going to use Jest. Jest is the default testing framework that comes with React Native, and it's already bundled for you. If you're using the initial template, you should have a test folder in the root of your project, but I'm not going to use that because I like my test to be right next to the components or the files. So I'm just going to delete that. I'm going to go into my source folder, then into stores, and here I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this file uistore.spec.ts. I'm just going to take the code from the lesson and I'm going to paste it. Right now you're going to see an error because it doesn't know what these functions are. So we will just add the typings for those. And okay, it works. So let us just explore what this does. So first I'm going to import my create UI store function directly from my UI store file. And I'm going to call the describe function. Now the describe function is just a way for you to group similar tests. There's nothing more than that. So you pass as the first parameter a string, which is going to be the name of this block of tests. And then you pass a function to it. So inside of the body, I'm going to declare a UI store instance, but I'm not going to initialize it yet. Then I'm going to create a mock of my root store so I can pass to this UI store. But right now it's empty. I don't need anything else. And then I'm going to call the before each function. This before each comes from Jest itself. And what this is going to do is before each individual test, it's going to call this function. So what I'm going to do is for each test, I'm going to create a new instance of my UI store. So my state inside of the store is clean. And I'm just going to pass my root mock to it. So let us write our first test. The first thing that I'm concerned is I want my store to be in a proper state whenever it starts. So I'm just gonna use the it function. I could also just use the test function. Both of them are the same. And I'm gonna put the name of my test. So you can see here I'm playing a little bit with the name of my describe block and my function. So I say the UI store is correctly initialized. Inside of it, I'm gonna use the expect function that also comes from Jest. And I'm gonna tell my UI store on the books array to have length 0 whenever it starts. Then I'm gonna say that the uppercase books, which is the computed property of books, should also have a length 0. In order to test this, I'm gonna run the yarn test command, which is gonna crawl through all my files and oh, sorry, I didn't save it, and detect all the spec files. And you can see that my test is correctly initialized. So it's always a good practice to see your test fail for the first time. So just to make sure, I'm gonna make it fail on purpose, right? So I expected the length 1 because that's what I said just it should have. Well, I'm actually getting a 0 array. Great. Great. So now we have our very basic test running to check the initial state of our application. We can move to the next test. So now I would like to test that my store actually fetches the books and stores them inside of the store. So this time I created a new test and I'm gonna pass an async function because unlike the other test, our fetch books function is an async function, right? It needs to go to the server and fetch the data and then come back. One thing to notice is right now I'm not running the backend. I'm not running anything. It's just VS Code. And let's see what our test gives if we try to run it like this. Oh, sorry. Great. So now you see there's an error that it says the async callback was not invoked within the 5000 millisecond timeout. So what's actually happening is that our UI store is trying to fetch the books, but if you take a look, we have passed a root mock that doesn't have anything inside of it. I mean, it has the API object, but it's empty, right? So this is internally, this is trying to call the fetch books function. It's just not finding anything. So we're gonna solve this by actually providing a mock implementation for our fetch books function. And here I'm just gonna call the jest.fn function. So the fn function is just a mock function that has a bunch of utilities inside of it. In our case, it's gonna allow us to do a mock implementation of it. So I'm just gonna go ahead and create a one-time mock implementation, right? So I'm just telling on my root mock, the API object, the fetch books, this is just a cast, so we can safely call this method. And this, what it does is just create a one-time implementation from the function. So I'm gonna pass a async function inside of it because it needs to be a promise. And I'm just gonna return a sample array, right? Let's just say this is what the server would return. So now if I try to run this, let me just run the test one more time. And we should be able to see that it fails once again, right? So why is it failing even though we have now provided a mock implementation? And the answer is it has to do with the async nature of MobX, right? Like we said, your state or your store might not be updated synchronously, right? So even though we're fetching the data and we're putting it on our store, it doesn't necessarily mean that whenever we call the rest of the code, our store has already been updated or the action has already completed, right? Even though we're awaiting for the action, the store might not be in its final state yet. So in order to solve this, we're gonna use a small utility from MobX itself. So I'm just gonna take it from the course lesson and I'm gonna import this when function from MobX. So let me just run the test to make sure everything's working. Okay, great, it works. So let's just go over it. The when function takes two parameters. The first one is going to be a conditional function that whenever this function returns true, it's going to run the second function passed to it. And this function, it's also an observer. So whatever observable you're using inside of it, whenever that changes, it's going to run itself. And then the when utility is going to also check for it. So inside of it, we're checking for the length of our books array, right? So because we have fetched the books, this will change. And we just say, you know, whenever the length is bigger than 0, whenever we have some data, we want to check our application. So then we just say we have a bunch of expectations, right? First of all, I want to make sure that on my API store, the fetch books function has been called, and I want to make sure it has been called once. So because we use the fetch just fn function, we can actually make sure that it has been called a certain amount of times. Then we want to make sure that the internal state of the store is correct, right? We want to make sure that the books array has something in it. We want to make sure that the first book or the first available item on the array, the title, it needs to match the data with that we have returned. We can also check for the computer properties because they should have updated themselves, right? Once our book array has changed. So that also should contain something. And the title should also be similar to the one before. And once we have that, we can finally say our test is done, right? So this is why I wanted to take a look into mocking, or testing, especially on the MobX side of things, because it's not quite as straightforward as other methods or as other frameworks where you can just write your test and await normally. MobX is designed differently, right? So you need to take that into account. So this was the final lesson on the JavaScript side of things. Of course, there's many more topics and many more things that you can learn and you can take a look. There will be links at the end of the course for you to continue on the JavaScript side of things, even more advanced topics. But on the next module, we will start looking into the macOS specifics and how we can use native macOS APIs to kind of create a very tailored experience for a desktop application. I'm looking forward to it.